Hey everyone, welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to give it a couple more minutes just to wait for any late arrivals. So just hang in there. Thank you. Hey everyone, thank you for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative, and in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through some of our volunteer opportunities and our events, and I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A function as we go on the bottom, but we won't get to those questions until the end. So a little bit about what we'll be covering today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we have identified to help us better understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our region's most pressing economic issues. But before moving on with the conversation about tech equity, I wanted to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar during very tough times and particularly tough for Black people. And as an organization, we've discussed how best to respond to the situation, including changing or canceling some of our upcoming events. But we felt that it's still important for us that when thinking of issues like police violence and police brutality, that we also address larger racial, structural inequities within our economic systems that are withholding and supporting a police state. So we want to continue hosting these conversations such as these and provide a space to talk about structural racial inequities. And I encourage you all to support organizations that are on the ground organizing just as much as organizations that are responding to racial inequities within our economy. So as an organization, we released a statement, which you can find on our website, techequitycollaborative.org. And we've included ways that you can step up and support organizations if you're able to. So why are we here? Well, Tech Equity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was a perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of the problem. They noticed things like rising rents, displacement, traffic, and an increase in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns. and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions. Especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse, and with an increased burden on low-income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are already uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. At the same time, tech workers have been relatively unscathed. As a result, the COVID-19 crisis has a potential to even further exacerbate inequality that our region was already feeling. So this is the state of our housing crisis in the Bay. I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know and feel this. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly. And this is really a sharp contrast with tech success, and without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated. Before the pandemic hit, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. Since the virus hit, 1.6 million Californians have filed for unemployment. So meanwhile, experts believe it's not likely that rents will fall much during this economic downturn. Rents are most likely to flatline, but people's incomes won't rebound quickly enough. So renters will be in a worse position overall. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or even worse. Communities are frustrated. And considering the graph that we just looked at, it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about all the changes that they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within tech and have really succeeded. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. While we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. We have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege and support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to be best engaged in a time of such uncertainty. Because of our affordability crisis, which is now compounded by the pandemic, we're at risk of losing so many critical components in our communities that make the Bay Area a hub of diversity and innovation. Over the last few decades, housing costs have skyrocketed due in part to limited supply. The housing crisis was already incredibly challenging for many families prior to the pandemic. And now, as thousands are filing for unemployment weekly, already unaffordable rents are impossible to meet. As a result, we've seen how longtime residents have been forced out, and we've seen how difficult it is for lower and middle income people to live near their jobs. So while some workers are finding success, many others are struggling to just make ends meet. And families that were already challenged by the status quo are now finding themselves unable to weather this new crisis. But we don't think that it has to be this way. At TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. And we can make it out of this crisis stronger than we were before, but only if we invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. We have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're ever to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in these communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar and joining the discussion today. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in this system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live through book clubs that we host, panel discussions with experts, webinars such as these, and voter guides. We activate you on a policy advocacy agenda that results in a more inclusive economy in your community through voter turnout, signature gathering, and lobbying. And finally, we connect you on a personal level to the community you live in and the people who live there outside of your tech bubble through some of our programming and campaigns, which we'll talk a little bit about today. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be working at the table alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. The pandemic has shown us that the health of our community depends on all of us, and we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. Our two key issue areas at TechEquity are housing and workforce and labor. And while housing costs are really a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices that we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community's feeling now, especially now during the pandemic. In the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings that guided investment. So the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image on the screen. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. There's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in the Bay Area. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the same neighborhoods and communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis that we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. In fact, it extends all across California and the US. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived within these red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock, like a huge rent increase, sudden loss of a job, a pandemic, things like that. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are currently in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival. But tech workers can now take a better role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling, and with unemployment on a steep rise and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are already facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. The cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $120,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom apartment working a regular, normal 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 30 hours a day to be able to afford that 2-bedroom. There are only 24 hours in a day, so we're actually setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city. And just to keep it in context, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford San Francisco. There's a common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income within the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers that are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are not receiving benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA goals, and it stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. So that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. As housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while high income folks are coming in and staying in. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by the crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living in today is the result of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So at TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. I'm going to give a brief overview, but if you have any questions, we can answer them at the end. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production, preservation, and protection. So production. We need to be building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. And finally, protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement, especially now as we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions for preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are now more at risk than ever before. And an economic downturn is also the ideal time to lean heavily into producing more affordable housing, as the cost of labor, materials, and land may decrease slightly within the current market conditions. We also need to make sure that we're all getting enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. So we were excited to see many tech companies step up and commit to continue paying contingent workers as offices close due to the pandemic. But we need to ensure that that same care and thoughtfulness goes into supporting those workers well beyond the pandemic. So we need to make sure that there are equitable on-ramps. There needs to be more access to good paying, high opportunity jobs. We need corporate responsibility. Companies need to be conscious of their impact in their communities and need to work with community leaders and organizations to ensure that their economic success is benefiting their neighbors as well. And finally, we need to make sure that all jobs are good jobs, that contractors and contingent workers are treated fairly. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with Tech Equity. We host tons of educational events. We have monthly event series, which you can sign up to on our website. Coming up, we have on September 3rd, a webinar about what tech can do to be anti-racist. That's an example of one of our panel discussions. We'll also have a election series. So if you're interested in what's going to be on the ballot in your city or in the statewide ballot, you can check out some of those. If you're interested in advocacy, you can volunteer to support our campaign to close corporate property tax loopholes and restore $12 billion a year that California communities need to recover from the crisis we're in. Or you can help with corporate policy through our responsible contracting campaigns. And the final way you can engage with us is through engaging with the community. So we connect tech workers with non-tech community members through some of our volunteer opportunities. So if you're a designer or an engineer, you can volunteer for one of our civic tech projects where we're building digital tools that are supporting renters and underserved communities to get access to the information that they need. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but also build community within the process. So what can you do today? You can do 3 things right after you get this call. You can tell a friend about our work, so our movement really is strengthened by having the voices of more supporters join us. You can take action on one of our campaigns, which I'll be talking about next, or you can become a member of Tech Equity. So the Bay Area's tech economy has been working only for some. And while there are great opportunities for people to find success here, many people around us are struggling to make ends meet. As I mentioned before, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've seen firsthand how the unaffordability crisis paired with a tech boom has worked for some, but not all. And as I mentioned, I have family who has pursued jobs within tech and has found lots of success, but also friends and family who are coming back from college and can't afford to move out of their parents' homes, for example. The Bay Area has the potential to be a ground where tech workers and community members are working side by side to bring equity to all. And through policy agendas, civic engagement, and active participation in our communities, we have an opportunity to create the neighborhoods that we've always envisioned to live in. We need to act now because our affordability crisis, it doesn't wait for anyone, and it impacts all aspects of our lives, from our housing to our families to our jobs. And in order to make the Bay Area a place that brings opportunity and prosperity for all, that means that we all need to chip in. And at Tech Equity, we're at it every day to bring forth policies that are protecting renters, that are building more affordable housing, and creating more access to job opportunities. So you can join Tech Equity as a member for $10 a month or $100 a year to bring your voice to the table and the change that we need in our communities. So now we'll be talking about some of the campaigns that we're a part of. So the first campaign is the Yes on Proposition 15 campaign, also known as Schools and Communities First. So local governments, from public health departments to school districts, are leading the fight right now against the pandemic. However, because of California's broken property tax system, they're doing it without all the resources that they need. So our coalition, Schools and Communities First, successfully submitted 1.7 million signatures to qualify our initiative on the ballot, which will now be Proposition 15. And it will bring back $12 billion to our schools and communities by closing a corporate property tax loophole and making sure that corporations are paying their fair share in taxes. So if you'd like to support this campaign, we're hosting phone banking sessions weekly on Wednesdays from 5:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. And you'll be able to contact voters and let them know about the measure and really get a sense if they support it. The next campaign we have is the Fair Chance at Housing campaign, also known as Banning the Box in Alameda County. And this campaign helps remove barriers for formerly incarcerated people to have more access to housing after being released from prison. So we successfully had ordinances passed in Oakland and in Berkeley in partnership with the organization Just Cities. So for this campaign, you can sign up or donate to support these efforts as we expand these protections throughout the entirety of Alameda County. And the last campaign we have is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which really highlights the work that we do at TechEquity Collaborative and how we partner with community organizations and center the needs of people who are feeling the pain of the affordability crisis more acutely than most of us in tech. So working alongside community members, legislators, and relevant stakeholders, we were able to identify a new policy intervention that could protect more renters than any law before in California history. This policy would prevent tenants from arbitrary and unjust evictions by requiring landlords to have a good cause for evicting a tenant. And it also prevented unfair rent increases and prevented price gouging by capping rent increases at no more than 10%. So as a result of our strong coalition, we were able to introduce a bill to the California legislature that was signed into law last October, so almost a year ago. And the Tenant Protection Act now extends protections to about 8 million California renters. But passing the law on its own wasn't enough for us. So we also needed to make sure that tenants knew their rights and could advocate for themselves. So we reached out to our network of TechEquity volunteers who donated their time and skills to create a new website that would help tenants navigate their rights under this new law. So that website is live. It's called tenantprotections.org. And it's already been used by thousands of California renters. So if you know anyone that could benefit from this tool, once again, that's tenantprotections.org. So once again, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, you can become a member of TechEquity Collaborative, or you can take action on one of our campaigns. And the pandemic has exposed us to how deep the cracks in our economy and our communities run. And when cities are setting aside issues like housing and fair labor conditions, it deepens inequity and leaves us vulnerable to things like future recessions, pandemics, and more. And because we've overlooked these issues in the Bay Area, it could set us back years in terms of recovery. So if you take one thing away from this webinar, we hope it's the realization that more equity within our communities actually strengthens our economy and safeguards us from a future crisis. So we hope you'll join us in advocating for a future that works for everyone. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So now will be the time for questions. So if you all have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A function. I do want to say that we'll be emailing out afterwards the presentation slides, as well with links to everything that I talked about. So don't worry about that. You also get a recording of the webinar within that email. We have a question from Rose, who's asking, are you focused primarily in California or all around the country? So right now we're focused mainly in California. We haven't expanded out of the all around the country yet. So just California right now. Does anyone else have any questions? And if you all think of any questions as well, you can just reply to that email, like I said, that we'll be sending out afterwards, and I'll personally respond to your question as well. So don't worry about it if you can't think of something right now. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so that's okay. I want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. We hope to see you at future events or have you join us as a member of Tech Equity Collaborative. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out an email with all the relevant links, the presentation slides, the recording, which you can share around. And if you have any questions, feel free to respond to that email and I'll be getting back to you as soon as I can. So thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.